Keep
In the
him
cold
steady.
concrete yard behind the precinct, the
Wait for the
air
command.
echoed with the sound
Easy.
of snarls. Chains rattling in short, sharp commands that went unanswered.
Kyle,
Rex,
stay.
a muscular German shepherd with eyes like shard of amber, lunged against his leash, teeth flashing as the handler stepped back. He wasn't just another K-9 trainee. He was the department's most promising recruit gone terribly wrong. Every officer
Keep an eye
had once
on Rex.
whispered that Rex could be the
He
best
seems
tracker in the county.
agitated.
The kind of dog legends were made of, but now, months into training, he had a new label that everyone feared to say out
Wind is
loud.
picking up.
Uncontrollable. Officer Daniel stood by the gate,
Stay right
arms
there.
folded, watching the chaos unfold. He had been training K-9 units for over 15 years. Dogs who had sniffed out narcotics, tracked missing people, and saved officers' lives.
Easy, boy,
But Rex was
easy.
different. The animal's
doesn't
aggression
listen.
wasn't born from fear or confusion. It was
Doesn't
something deeper,
bond.
something almost haunted.
Doesn't
He doesn't
trust.
listen, doesn't bond, doesn't trust. Daniels muttered to himself as the dog's handler struggled to keep control.
Get
The
back.
other officers exchanged uneasy glances. More than once, Rex had snapped without warning, not in fear, but fury. 2 trainers had already quit after near misses. Now, no one wanted to go near him without body armor. Inside the training office, the whispers grew louder. Maybe it's time to let him go.
Maybe it's time
One of
to
the
let
younger
him
officers said
go.
quietly. He's dangerous. What if he hurt someone? Daniels didn't respond right away. The word let go in their world didn't just mean releasing Rex into the wild. It meant something final. Something that sat like a stone in his stomach. He remembered the first day he'd seen Rex, a stray, found near a burned-down warehouse, trembling but alert, eyes sharp, scanning everything. The dog had shown extraordinary intelligence, reacting to hand signals and scent trails with uncanny precision. But something inside him had changed after that, as if whatever he had seen in that warehouse fire had burned more than just the world around him. It had burned his trust in people. That afternoon, Daniels called the chief. He's not responding to training protocols, he said heavily. He's too volatile for active duty. The chief sighed on the other end of the line. We've invested months, Daniels, but we can't risk another incident. Filed a report will classify him as failed. Daniels hung up the phone and stared at the empty yard through the window. Rex sat at the far end, chain taut, chest rising and falling in slow defiance. The dog looked toward him with a strange mixture of anger and longing, as if daring him to understand. Daniels almost thought he saw a flicker of sadness there, something human in its depth, before Rex turned away and growled at the shadows. The next morning, word spread across the precinct. Rex would be decommissioned. For most officers, it was just another case, a failed dog, a line on a report. But for Daniels, it felt personal. He'd seen countless dogs come and go, but Rex's story unsettled him. There was brilliance trapped inside that chaos, potential inside the fury. Still, the department couldn't take chances. A final evaluation was scheduled for the weekend, one last attempt to see if the dog could be calmed, rehabilitated, or, at the very least, understood before being permanently retired. A crowd was expected, officers, local families, maybe even a few journalists. It would be a demonstration of what could have been. When Saturday arrived, the training yard was brighter than usual, sunlight glinting off the polished badges of the officers standing in a line. Children pointed and smiled at the police dogs trotting obediently beside their handlers. But when Rex was brought out, the laughter stopped. His presence was electric, not joyful, but tense. Every muscle in his body seemed coiled, his fur bristling as he scanned the crowd. He barked, low and warning, and the other dogs instinctively backed away. Daniels could feel the shift in the air, that invisible current of fear and fascination that followed the animal everywhere. "He's beautiful," someone in the crowd whispered. "Yes," Daniels said under his breath, "beautiful and broken." As the demonstration began, the handlers moved Rex into position. The idea was simple, a basic obedience test. Sit, stay, heel, commands that every trained dog could perform effortlessly. But Rex refused. He stood rigid, muscles trembling, eyes darting toward the edge of the crowd. Then, in an instant, he snapped, lunging forward with such force that the handler lost his footing. The crowd gasped. Officers stepped in, trying to calm him, shouting his name, pulling him back. For a few moments, chaos reigned, the kind that makes even trained men freeze. Daniels rushed forward, grabbing the leash, his voice firm. "Rex, easy, easy, boy." But the dog wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, wild, as if he was seeing ghosts only he could perceive. The scene ended with Rex being dragged away, still snarling, his fate seemingly sealed. Parents clutched their children tighter. Officers avoided eye contact. The chief shook his head. "That's it," he said quietly. "He's done. We can't risk him anymore." Daniels didn't argue this time. He just stood there, sweat running down his temples, heart heavy. As the sun dipped lower, the yard emptied, leaving only the echo of distant barks and the metallic clatter of the gate closing behind the K9 kennels. Rex sat in his cage that evening, breathing heavily, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Somewhere deep inside, the animal that once trusted humanity was gone, replaced by a creature shaped by confusion, fear, and memories no one could erase. And yet, for reasons no one could explain, Daniels couldn't bring himself to sign the final release form. He lingered at his desk, staring at Rex's file long after everyone had gone home. Outside, the wind howled through the alleyways of the small town, and the precinct lights flickered. In that silence, Daniels whispered to no one in particular. Maybe he's not uncontrollable. Maybe he's just waiting for the right person to understand him. He didn't know that person would arrive sooner than anyone imagined, and that it would not be a trainer, an officer, or an adult at all, but a boy who saw the world through darkness and listened with his heart. Miles away from the police precinct, in a quiet neighborhood framed by maple trees and whispering wind chimes, lived a boy named Ethan Cole. He was 7 years old, with chestnut brown hair and a gentle face that never quite looked where people expected. Ethan was born with a rare degenerative eye condition, one that took his sight completely by the time he was 4. For most children, the world is made of colors, shapes, and movement. For Ethan, it was made of sound, scents, and textures. He navigated his home by the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the warmth of sunlight through the window. Every sound was a landmark, every smell a direction. Where others saw a world of images, Ethan imagined one of melodies and echoes. His mother, Claire, used to tell him stories at night about heroes, animals, and the kind of friendships that only happen once in a lifetime. She worked as a piano teacher, and sometimes when she practiced, Ethan would sit close by, placing his small hand on the wooden body of the instrument. He couldn't see the keys, but he could feel the vibration of every note, the rhythm of her fingers moving like rain across the surface. Music was his window into the world, a language that needed no sight. "Mom," he'd say softly, "I can see the song." And she would smile, tears glistening in her eyes, and whisper, "Then you see more than most." Despite his blindness, Ethan's mind was a constellation of curiosity. He wanted to know how everything worked, how rain sounded different on roofs and on trees, how wind changed its song before a storm, how footsteps could tell you if someone was sad or happy. But the world outside wasn't always kind to him. Children his age didn't understand. At the local park, some would stare or whisper, not out of cruelty but confusion. He didn't notice the looks, but he felt the distance. He had learned early that silence would be a shield. Yet, beneath that calm exterior was a child who longed for connection, for someone who didn't just guide him but truly understood him. One afternoon, Claire took Ethan to a community event hosted by the local police department, a safety day where officers demonstrated K9 units, patrol cars, and community programs. She hoped it would be something new for him to experience, maybe even hear the dogs bark or the sirens wail from up close. Ethan clutched his white cane in one hand and held his mother's arm with the other as they walked through the chatter and laughter of the crowd. "Mom, what's that sound?" he asked, tilting his head toward the distance. There was a sharp bark, deep, powerful, filled with something that made his chest tighten. "That's one of the police dog, honey," she said gently. "They're showing how they help officers find people and protect them." Ethan listened carefully, tracing the sound. The bark wasn't like the others he'd heard. It wasn't playful or eager. It was lonely. There was a rhythm in it, a tremor that carried anger but also confusion. His brow furrowed. "He's scared," he said suddenly. Claire looked at him, startled. "Who?" "The dog," Ethan whispered. "He's not angry. He's scared and sad." His mother squeezed his hand, unsure what to say. She could see a commotion near the far end of the yard. Officers pulling back a large German shepherd that was clearly agitated. The animal's growl rolled like thunder, sending ripples through the crowd. Parents stepped back, holding their children close. "Ethan," she said softly, "let's move back a little." But the boy shook his head. "No, Mom. He's calling." She frowned. "Calling?" Ethan nodded. "It's like when someone shouts but doesn't use words." For the rest of the demonstration, Ethan stayed quiet, listening. Every bark, every shout, every order was a note in a song. He was trying to understand. When the crowd began to disperse after the failed display, he tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we go closer? Just for a minute?" She hesitated. Officers were still calming the dog down, and tension hung thick in the air. "It's not safe, sweetie. That dog isn't like the others." Ethan's lower lip trembled slightly, but he nodded, sensing her worry. "Okay," he said softly. But as they turned to leave, he couldn't shake the echo of that bark from his mind. It wasn't aggression he'd heard. It was heartbreak. That night, while Claire tucked him into bed, Ethan asked, "Mom, do you think dogs can feel lonely like people do?" She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. "Of course they can, darling. Dogs feel love, fear, sadness, just like us." "Why?" He turned his head toward the window, with a faint sound of distant traffic whispered like the sea. "Because there was one today," he said slowly. He sounded like he forgot how to trust, like he used to have someone who loved him but lost them. Claire froze for a second. His words carried a depth far beyond his years. "You're such a special boy," she murmured, kissing his forehead. "You hear the things most people never notice." Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He asked his mother questions about the police unit, about how they train dogs, about what happened to them if they didn't pass. Claire tried to answer gently, but when she mentioned that sometimes the dogs were retired early, Ethan's face grew pale. "You mean they don't get another chance?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, realizing too late that her pause was an answer in itself. "That's not fair," he whispered. "Maybe they just need someone to talk to them right." By Thursday, he made up his mind. When Claire mentioned she had to return to the police community office to drop off donation paperwork, Ethan insisted on coming along. He didn't say why. He just held his cane a little tighter and wore that thoughtful expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he'd already decided something in his heart. When they arrived at the station, he could hear the distant barking again. It was unmistakable, that same deep, aching voice. He turned his head toward the sound, smiling faintly. "It's him," he said, and though Claire tried to guide him away, something unseen, maybe faith, maybe fate, was already pulling him toward the one creature everyone else had given up on. The police training yard was quieter than usual that Friday morning, but tension hummed like a live wire in the air. A few officers lingered by the gates, watching as preparations began for what was meant to be Rex's final evaluation. Officer Daniels stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, his face lined with fatigue and guilt. He knew the decision had already been made. The department had ruled Rex unfit for service, but a part of him still clung to the hope that something might change. Maybe the dog just needed the right trigger, the right moment to show he wasn't lost. Maybe Claire had brought Ethan with her that day, though she hadn't planned to stay long. She had paperwork to sign, and the boy had insisted on coming along again. "Just for a few minutes," he'd said, gripping his cane, that faint but confident smile on his lips. "I just want to listen." Daniels noticed them as they entered the yard and greeted Claire warmly. He'd met her once before during a neighborhood safety program, but today his eyes briefly drifted toward the small boy at her side. "Hey there, champ," he said gently. "You like dogs?" Ethan tilted his head toward the voice. "I don't know," he replied softly. "I've never met one who liked me back." Daniels chuckled, though the words landed with unexpected weight. "Well, maybe that'll change someday," he said kindly. At the far end of the yard, two handlers struggled to lead Rex out of his enclosure. The clinking of the chain collar filled the space, metallic, sharp, and ominous. The German shepherd's steps were heavy. His muscles tense beneath his glossy black and tan coat. His eyes darted everywhere, scanning, calculating. The moment he saw the group of officers waiting, he growled. Low and guttural, the kind of sound that made even seasoned men instinctively take a step back. "Easy, Rex," one handler murmured. "It's just a test, boy." But Rex wasn't listening. He never did. Daniels raised his hand. "Let's start simple," he called out. "Heel, sit, stay. If he obeys even one, we'll proceed. If not, we end this." The officers nodded grimly. The command was given short, sharp, precise. "Sit." Rex didn't move. His gaze shifted instead toward the crowd forming near the fence. Among them stood Ethan and Claire, the boy clutching his mother's arm, face turned slightly upward, as if reading the air. Daniels followed Rex's gaze and frowned. The dog's body had stiffened, not in aggression this time, but focus. It was as if he had sensed something that no one else could. "Sit," the handler repeated louder. Rex's tail flicked once, then twice, and suddenly the dog lunged, not toward the handler this time, but toward the sound of a child's small cane tapping against the ground. The chain jerked violently as handlers shouted, muscles straining to hold him back. The crowd gasped. Claire screamed, instinctively pulling Ethan close. Officers rushed forward. Daniels barked orders, "Hold him! Pull back!" But chaos was already in motion. For a few terrifying seconds, it looked like Rex might break free. But Ethan didn't scream. He didn't run. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, listening. Amidst the shouting, the barking, the panic, he heard something no one else did. Beneath the growl, beneath the rage, there was pain. Not physical, but something deeper, rawer, the sound of an animal lost between fear and memory. And before anyone could stop him, Ethan took a small step forward. "Ethan!" Claire cried, voice breaking. "Stop!" The boy ignored her. His hand reached out into the air, fingers trembling but certain. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, a word no one around him recognized. It wasn't English. It wasn't a command. It was a name, a sound carried with tenderness, old and strange, like a lullaby whispered in another lifetime. "Kale." The effect was immediate. Rex froze. His body went rigid, head snapping toward the boy. The growl stopped mid-breath, replaced by a silence so thick it felt sacred. One handler, mid-pull, stumbled backward as the tension in the leash suddenly vanished. The dog stood still, chest heaving, ears twitching. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he sat down, slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on Ethan. Daniel stared, disbelief etched across his face. "What just happened?" he muttered. Claire, too, was frozen in place, one hand over her mouth. Ethan smiled faintly, still facing Rex, his small fingers stretched out as if to touch the air between them. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "You're not bad. You're just scared." Rex let out a low whine, a sound no one had ever heard from before. His eyes, once hard and burning, softened. The handlers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Daniel slowly stepped forward, holding out a cautious hand. "Easy, boy," he said. Rex didn't react. His focus remained entirely on Ethan. The boy took another step closer, guided by the quiet pulse of trust that had somehow formed between them. "You remember that word, don't you?" he whispered. "It means you can rest." Daniel swallowed hard. Something was happening that defied every rule of training, every principle he'd known. Dogs didn't just stop like that, not after months of failed conditioning, not because of a word from a stranger. Finally, he knelt beside Ethan. "Kid," he said softly, voice trembling, "how did you do that?" Ethan turned toward the sound of his voice, that serene smile never fading. "I didn't do anything," he said. He just needed someone to listen. For a long moment, no one spoke. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Rex's tail moved once, a slow, tentative wag. Then, against all logic, he lay down at the boy's feet, lowering his head until it rested on the dusty ground near Ethan's shoes. And in that single, impossible gesture, a story that began with fear and failure found its first spark of grace. Daniels felt something stir in his chest, the weight of understanding, of awe. Maybe, he whispered under his breath, we were the ones who didn't understand him. Rex's eyes fluttered shut, and Ethan, still smiling faintly, reached down until his small fingers brushed the top of the dog's head. The fur was warm beneath his touch, trembling slightly as if afraid to believe this peace was real. The crowd, once buzzing with panic, now stood in reverent silence. No one dared to move, because in that moment, in the quiet between a child's whisper and a broken dog's breath, something impossible had happened. The uncontrollable had been tamed, not by command or force, but by compassion that spoke in a language older than words. The yard was still, as if time itself had paused to make sense of what had just occurred. Even the wind held its breath. The handlers, still gripping the slackened leash, stared in disbelief at Rex, the same animal that had once terrified them, now lying calmly beside the small, blind boy who had done what none of them could. Officer Daniels approached cautiously, eyes flicking between the two as though afraid that one wrong move would shatter the fragile peace that had settled there. "Kid," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper, "what was that word you said?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, his unseeing eyes turned toward the sound. "It was just a name," he murmured. "I don't know where I heard it. It just felt right." Daniels frowned. "Kale," he repeated under his breath, tasting the syllables. It was foreign, strange, but not random. Something about it stirred a faint recognition, like an echo from another language, one that carried warmth and sorrow in equal measure. "You said like you knew him," Daniel said quietly. "I think I did," Ethan said, his voice soft but sure. "Not here." He touched his chest. "Here." Rex shifted then, a subtle movement, his nose brushing gently against Ethan's leg. The boy smiled, feeling the coarse fur beneath his fingertips as he reached out. For the first time, the dog didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, releasing a low, contented sigh. To everyone watching, it was as though the animal's entire spirit had exhaled. The tension that had gripped his body for months melted away in a single gesture of trust. Claire watched with tears in her eyes, unsure if she was witnessing a miracle or madness. "Ethan," she whispered, "maybe we should let the officers—" "It's okay, Mom," Ethan interrupted gently, his hand never leaving Rex's head. "He's not going to hurt me." And somehow she believed him. Daniels crouched down, scanning Rex closely. The dog's pupils were calm, his breathing steady. It didn't make sense. No sedative, no training technique, no human command had ever managed this. "You've got some kind of magic touch, kid," Daniel said with a shaky laugh. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's not magic. He just remembered something." "Remembered?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "That word, it means something to him." He turned his face upward, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. It's like it brought him home. For the rest of that day, Rex refused to leave Ethan's side. Whenever an officer tried to lead him away, the dog resisted, his gaze locked on the boy. When Ethan left the yard briefly to sit with his mother, Rex whimpered, pacing in circles until the boy returned. It was as if an invisible thread had been tied between them, fragile but unbreakable. That evening, Daniels called the precinct chief. "You need to see this," he said, voice tinged with awe. "The kid—" He did something to Rex. Or maybe the other way around. The chief, skeptical but curious, arrived an hour later. By then the sun was low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. The yard was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of Ethan's cane and the soft patter of Rex's paws beside him. Daniels gestured silently toward the pair, and the chief stopped mid-step. "You're telling me," he whispered, "that's the same dog who tried to attack 2 handlers last month?" "The very same," Daniels said. "Watch." Ethan stopped walking and crouched slightly. "Sit," he said. The word was gentle, almost uncertain, yet Rex obeyed instantly. The boy smiled. "Good boy." He reached out, feeling for the dog's head, and Rex leaned into his palm, tail brushing the ground. The chief rubbed his temples. "I don't understand," he muttered. "What kind of training did he respond to?" "None." Daniels replied simply. He just heard a word and remembered who he was. The chief shook his head, half in disbelief, half in wonder. What's the word? Daniels hesitated. Kale. The chief froze. Say that again? Kale. That's what the boy said. For a long moment, the older man didn't speak. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, Rex wasn't always Rex. When he was rescued from that warehouse fire 2 years ago, his tag was burned, but part of his name was still legible, K, before the rest melted away. We thought it was nonsense. But the shelter logs listed him as Kale. We changed it when we brought him into service. Daniels blinked, realization dawning. So the kid didn't just make it up. No, the chief said. He remembered the name before any of us did. Ethan, still kneeling beside the dog, tilted his head. I didn't remember, he said softly. He did. I just said it for him. The word sent a shiver through everyone there. Rex or Kale nuzzled the boy's shoulder, his breath warm against the child's cheek. Ethan giggled quietly, his fingers tracing the dog's muzzle. You don't have to be angry anymore, he whispered. It's over. That night, Daniels couldn't sleep. He replayed the scene again and again. The boy's whisper, the dog's surrender, the inexplicable peace that had settled over them. He'd spent a lifetime studying obedience, discipline, and behavioral science, yet none of it explained what he'd witnessed. Some bond, he realized, are forged not by training or authority, but by something far older, something that speaks between hearts, not mouths. Before leaving the precinct, he checked on Rex one last time. To his surprise, the boy and his mother were still there. Ethan sat cross-legged outside the kennel, humming softly. Inside, Rex lay pressed against the bars, eyes half closed, ears twitching to the rhythm of the tune. It wasn't a lullaby Daniels recognized, but it was beautiful, hauntingly so. He knelt beside the boy. What's that song? Ethan smiled faintly. I don't know, he said. It's the one he remembers. When the chief approached the next morning, Daniels was waiting with a new proposal. Let's not put him down, he said. Not yet. Let's give the boy a chance to work with him. 1 week. If it doesn't work, I'll sign the papers myself. The chief hesitated, then nodded slowly. 1 week, he agreed. But if anything goes wrong... It won't, Daniels interrupted, glancing at the boy, who was now laughing quietly as Rex licked his hands. He's already found what we couldn't. For the first time in months, the precinct felt lighter, as if the shadows that had haunted its kennels were finally retreating. And all because a blind boy had whispered a forgotten word into the darkness and been heard. The week that followed was unlike anything the precinct had ever witnessed. Each morning, Ethan arrived with his mother, his small white cane tapping softly on the pavement, while Rex, or Kale, as Ethan continued to call him, waited by the kennel gate, ears perked, tail flicking with anticipation. The other officers had grown used to seeing the boy now, though their curiosity hadn't faded. Some called it a miracle, others called it luck. But as the days unfolded, it became clear that what was happening between the boy and the dog wasn't chance. It was something deeper, something born from trust that defied reason. Daniel set up a quiet section of the training yard for them. No loud commands, no whistles, no distractions. Just the boy, the dog, and the whisper of wind through the fences. You ready, kid? Daniels asked the first morning, clipboard in hand. Ethan smiled faintly. He's ready, he said, pointing his chin toward Rex, who sat obediently by his feet. Daniels couldn't help but chuckle. You're the only one who seems to know what's going on inside that dog's head. Ethan tilted his head, listening to the faint rhythm of Rex's breathing. It's easy, he said simply. He tells me everything. The first exercise was a test of obedience. Simple motions, basic words. Sit, Ethan said softly, and Rex obeyed without hesitation. Stay. The dog froze, muscles still, eyes alert. Come. He trotted forward and rested his head against the boy's knee. Daniel scribbled notes furiously, shaking his head in disbelief. He's never done that. Not once, he muttered. Every session brought new surprises. Ethan didn't use standard K9 commands or hand signals. He spoke in calm tones, sometimes even in that strange melodic hum that seemed to soothe Rex. And Rex responded not to dominance or discipline, but to rhythm, tone, and trust. By the third day, something extraordinary happened. During a scent tracking test, Daniels had cloth soaked in human scent 50 yards away, a task Rex had always failed due to agitation. But this time, Ethan knelt beside him and whispered, "Fine." It wasn't a command, it was encouragement, a promise. Rex sniffed the ground, tail wagging, and then, to everyone's astonishment, followed the trail perfectly, finding the cloth in less than 2 minutes. When he returned, Ethan clapped his hands in delight, laughing, a sound so pure and bright that even the hardened officers couldn't help but smile. Rex barked once, a playful sound that no one had ever heard from before. "Look at that," Daniels whispered to one of the handlers. "The beast that wouldn't heal is now playing fetch with a child who can't see him." Every day deepened the bond between them. Ethan would sit on the ground beside Rex for hours, just talking, not training, just talking. He told him stories about the stars he couldn't see, about the sound of rain on rooftops, about dreams he had where everything was made of light. "You know," he said one afternoon, scratching Rex's ear, "Mom says people have to see to believe, but I think it's the other way around. You have to believe first." Rex licked his hand in response, as if agreeing. Claire watched from a distance, torn between pride and fear. She saw her son blossom in a way she hadn't seen since he lost his sight, confident, alive, filled with purpose. But she also worried. The bond between the boy and the dog was powerful, yes, but what would happen when the week ended? What if they took Rex away? She couldn't bear to see Ethan's heart broken again. That worry wasn't hers alone. Daniels and the chief discussed it privately. "We can't keep him," the chief said, shaking his head. "Department policy is clear. Once a K-9 is deemed unfit." "He's not unfit anymore," Daniels interrupted. "You saw it yourself." "I saw a miracle, not a policy exception." The chief sighed. "You really believe this kid can keep him calm forever?" Daniels hesitated. "I don't know, but I believe that dog would die before he ever hurt that boy." That evening, after the others had left, Daniels lingered in the yard. Ethan and Rex were still sitting together under the fading light. The boy was humming again, his hand resting on the dog's back. Daniels crouched nearby. "You know," he said, "when I started training dogs, they taught us everything was about dominance, being the alpha, giving orders. But you don't order him around. You just talk to him." Ethan smiled. "That's because he doesn't need a master. He just needs a friend." The simplicity of that answer struck Daniels harder than he expected. Over the next few days, Rex began to change in ways that defied logic. The aggression vanished completely. He responded to others now, cautiously, but without hostility. He even tolerated brief petting from other officers, though his loyalty to Ethan remained absolute. If the boy moved, Rex followed. If Ethan tripped or stumbled, Rex was there, steadying him with his body. It was as though the dog had taken it upon himself to be the boy's eyes. One afternoon, Daniels decided to test just how deep their connection ran. Without warning, he dropped a metal pole a few yards away. A sharp, sudden clang meant to startle the dog. Every K-9 instinct should have triggered a defensive reaction, but Rex didn't even flinch. Instead, he looked up at Ethan, waiting for a cue. The boy merely whispered, "It's okay," and Rex relaxed. Daniel's throat tightened. "You've changed him," he said quietly. "Or maybe he's changed you." Ethan smiled. "Both, I think." By the end of the week, word had spread far beyond the precinct. Reporters called it the miracle bond. Psychologists wanted to study it. Animal behaviorists offered theories. Scent recognition, voice frequency, neurological triggers. But none of their explanations captured the truth, because those who stood there, who witnessed it firsthand, knew that what connected Ethan and Rex wasn't science. It was something far simpler, love, unspoken but understood. When the week ended, the chief stood before Ethan and Claire, expression unreadable. "The evaluation period is over," he said. "We'll review the results." Ethan nodded, his hand still resting on Rex's head. "He did great," he said proudly. "He's not scared anymore." The chief hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You're right. He's not. As the boy and his mother turned to leave, Rex whimpered, tugging gently against his leash. The sound was soft but filled with desperation. Ethan crouched down, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'll see you soon." But as they drove away, Daniel saw Rex sit down at the gate, unmoving, staring into the distance long after the car had disappeared. And in that stillness, the truth was clear. Whatever force had brought them together wasn't done yet. It was only waiting for the moment when their bond would be tested, not in peace, but in danger. The decision to allow Ethan to continue working with Rex, officially now called Cale again, was not made lightly. The precinct's review board met twice that week, debating between protocol and possibility. Some argued it was a public relations stunt. Others, like Officer Daniels, saw something more profound. "You can't quantify what that boy does," he told them firmly. "He doesn't train with rules. He trains with heart." In the end, they reach a compromise. Ethan could assist under supervision on a probationary basis to see if Cale could be rehabilitated for light service work, therapy visits, search demonstrations, non-combat duties. When Claire received the call from Daniels explaining the decision, she was hesitant. "He's only 7, she said softly. "He's just a boy." "I know," Daniels replied, "but he's the only one Cale listens to. We'll keep them safe, I promise." So it began. Every afternoon after school, Ethan and his mother arrived at the precinct. The yard became their classroom, the world beyond their audience. Daniels observed from a distance, documenting everything. Cale's responses, body language, obedience patterns. What unfolded before his eyes wasn't standard training. It was something more like healing. Ethan never raised his voice, never used force. Instead, he spoke to Cale as one might speak to a friend who had forgotten how to hope. "Let's walk, Cale," he'd say, and the dog would match his pace perfectly, slowing when Ethan hesitated, stopping when he stumbled. If Ethan dropped his cane, Cale would nudge it back toward his hand, a learned reflex no one had taught him. The officers who once viewed Cale with fear now gathered daily to watch. One whispered to another, "I used to think that dog was possessed. Now look at him. He's like a guardian angel." Daniels nodded silently. "Not possessed," he murmured. "Just lost. And that boy found him." As the days passed, Cale began performing complex tasks, retrieving items, tracking scents, responding to subtle tone shifts in Ethan's voice. What astonished the trainers most was the accuracy. Ethan would give vague directions like, "Go find it," without even specifying an object, and Cale somehow knew exactly what to do. "It's like he reads my thoughts," Ethan explained one day. "He hears the picture I make in my head." Daniels, though skeptical, couldn't deny the results. "You're telling me he understands your intent, not your command?" Ethan nodded. "When I say find, I don't think about words. I think about what I mean, what it feels like to look for something." The statement was simple, yet profound. For a blind child, seeing wasn't about eyes. It was about intuition, awareness, emotional vibration. And somehow, Cale was tuned perfectly to that frequency. One afternoon, Daniels decided to test something. He placed several identical objects on the field, gloves, ropes, and a small ball, but hid a whistle Ethan had once used deep inside a crate. "Let's see if he can find this," Daniels said, handing Ethan one of the gloves. The boy smiled faintly. "He can," he replied confidently. Ethan knelt beside Cale. "Listen," he whispered, touching the dog's head. "Remember the sound that called you when you were scared? Find that." Cale sniffed the air, paused, and then darted off with precision, weaving past the obstacles, ignoring false scents, stopping only when he reached the crate. He barked twice, pawing at the lid. Inside lay the whistle. Daniel's jaw dropped. "How the hell?" He stopped himself mid-sentence, shaking his head. "That's not training. That's connection." Over time, Cale's reputation spread. Other precincts sent representatives to watch. Videos surfaced online, showing the blind boy and the once uncontrollable K9 working in perfect harmony. People called him the boy who sees with his heart, and the dog who listens with his soul. The local news ran a feature titled "Whisper Training: How Empathy Healed a Broken K9. But beyond the cameras and headlines, something quieter was happening. Ethan was changing too. Before Cale, he had been withdrawn, content to live within the small world of sound and touch. Now he moved with confidence, exploring new spaces with Cale at his side. He laughed more. He asked questions about the police work, how they found people, how the dogs helped in rescues. "Can Cale help find lost kids?" he asked one day. Daniels hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Maybe someday," he said finally. "But that's serious work, Ethan. It takes focus, discipline." Ethan nodded solemnly. "He can do it. He just needs someone to believe he can." It was a phrase that would echo in Daniel's mind long after. The training session soon evolved. Ethan and Cale began mock search drills, tracking volunteers who were behind trees or around buildings. Time and again, Cale succeeded, guided not by commands but by empathy. He moved as if feeling the person's fear or presence before scent alone could lead him. The pattern became so consistent that Daniel started calling it emotional radar. "He doesn't find people," he told the chief, half joking. "He feels them." Yet behind all the wonder, there lingered an unspoken truth. Cale was still technically an unfit K-9. The department couldn't officially reinstate him without a certified handler. And Ethan, brilliant as he was only 7. Over time, Cale's reputation spread. Other precincts sent representatives to watch. Videos surfaced online, showing the blind boy and the once uncontrollable K-9 working in perfect harmony. People called him the boy who sees with his heart and the dog who listens with his soul. The local news ran a feature titled Whisper Training, How Empathy Healed a Broken K-9. But beyond the cameras and headlines, something quieter was happening. Ethan was changing too. Before Cale, he had been withdrawn, content to live within the small world of sound and touch. Now he moved with confidence, exploring new spaces with Cale at his side. He laughed more. He asked questions about the police work, how they found people, how the dogs helped in rescues. "Can Cale help find lost kids?" he asked one day. Daniels hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Maybe someday," he said finally. "But that's serious work, Ethan. It takes focus, discipline." Ethan nodded solemnly. "He can do it. He just needs someone to believe he can." It was a phrase that would echo in Daniel's mind long after. The training session soon evolved. Ethan and Cale began mock search drills, tracking volunteers who were behind trees or around buildings. Time and again, Cale succeeded, guided not by commands but by empathy. He moved as if feeling the person's fear or presence before scent alone could lead him. The pattern became so consistent that Daniel started calling it emotional radar. "He doesn't find people," he told the chief, half joking. "He feels them." Yet behind all the wonder, there lingered an unspoken truth. Cale was still technically an unfit K-9. The department couldn't officially reinstate him without a certified handler. And Ethan, brilliant as he was only 7. Then, one fateful afternoon, the unthinkable happened. A call came in. A young child had gone missing near the old quarry, a place dense with woods and dangerous slopes. The search teams were mobilizing, but daylight was fading fast. Daniel stood in the yard as officers scrambled for gear. His eyes fell on Ethan, who was sitting quietly with Cale, sensing the urgency in the air. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked softly. "Missing boy," Daniel said. "It's a rough area. We're heading out." Ethan frowned, tilting his head. "Cale wants to go." Daniels blinked. "What?" "He can help," Ethan said firmly. "He told me." The officer hesitated. "That's not how this works, kid." But Cale was already standing, tail high, eyes alert. He barked once, short, decisive, commanding attention. Daniel stared into the dog's gaze and saw something there. The same fire he'd seen in the field dogs before rescue. Except this time, it wasn't rage or defiance. It was purpose. "Sir," one of the handlers said, "we're running out of time. The thermal drones can't see through the quarry mist." Daniels took a deep breath, then turned to Ethan. "If I let him go, you stay here. Do you understand?" Ethan shook his head. "No, he needs me to guide him." The room fell silent. The chief, who had just entered, looked between them. The officer, the blind boy, and the dog waiting by the door like destiny itself. "You can't be serious," he said quietly. But Daniels, voice steady and certain, replied, "Sir, I think we're about to see what impossible really looks like." Darkness had already begun to swallow the edge of the forest when the search team arrived at the quarry. The air was cold, thick with mist rising from the ravine below. The flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars painted fleeting streaks across the trees, colors that Ethan could not see but could hear in the vibrations of the world around him. Every siren had a hum, every footstep a rhythm, and tonight all of them pulsed with the same desperate urgency. Somewhere out there, a little boy named Noah, barely 6 years old, had gone missing. He'd wandered away from a family picnic near the cliffs. The terrain was dangerous, the woods dense, and time was running out. Officer Daniels stood by the edge of the cordoned area, radio crackling against his shoulder. "Teams Alpha and Bravo, fan out east and south," he ordered. "Stay on open channels. Keep noise low. The kid might respond if he hears his name." He turned to Ethan, who stood beside Cale, his small hands resting on the dog's back. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" Daniels asked one last time. Ethan nodded. "He can feel where the boy is," he said softly. The chief, standing nearby, frowned. "This isn't procedure, Daniels. We can't send a blind child into a search zone at night. What if—" Daniels cut him off. "He's not just a child tonight, sir. He's Cale's handler." The words hung in the air. The chief hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "You stay within range," he said to Daniels. "One step out of line, and I pull them both out." Daniels placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We stick together. You listen to my voice, I'll listen to yours." "Deal." "Deal," Ethan said, his tone steady. Cale whined softly, his body vibrating with restless energy. When Daniels unclipped the leash, the dog immediately lowered his head, sniffing the air, then began to move forward, slow, deliberate, as if each step was a question he was answering with instinct. Ethan followed closely, his cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. Daniels trailed behind, flashlights sweeping through the fog. Minutes turned to an hour. The forest was alive with the whispers of insects and the distant rush of water from the quarry's depths. Every now and then, a voice would echo faintly from a nearby search team. "Noah, Noah, can you hear us?" But there was no reply, only the haunting stillness of the trees. Suddenly, Cale stopped, his ears perked up, body tense. A low growl rippled through his chest. "What is it?" Daniels whispered. Ethan tilted his head. "He hears something. A cry, very soft." He pointed to the left. "There." Daniel swept his flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing beyond mist and shadows. "You're sure?" Ethan nodded. "He's scared." "Not Cale, the other boy. He's crying, but it's quiet, like he's trying not to be found." They moved forward cautiously. The slope grew steeper, the ground slick with mud and leaves. Cale led the way, his paws silent, tail stiff like an arrow. At one point he paused and looked back, as if to make sure Ethan was still there. The boy smiled faintly. "Go on, Cale. I'm right here." And he was. Though he couldn't see, Ethan's connection to the world around him felt sharper than sight. He could sense the shift in air pressure, the slight tremor in Cale's breathing. Even the vibration of a distant sob carried through the fog. Then, without warning, Cale barked, a single, sharp sound that echoed through the night. Daniels rushed forward, flashlight beam catching a faint shimmer of something metallic ahead. A child's shoe. "Over here." Daniels shouted into his radio. "We got a trail northwest of the ridge." Cale bounded forward, barking again. Ethan quickened his pace, guided by the dog's movements and Daniel's steady voice behind him. When they reached the clearing, they found Noah, huddled beneath a fallen tree, shivering, mud streaked across his face. His small voice trembled as he whispered, "I got lost." Daniels knelt, checking him quickly. "He's okay, cold and scared, but okay." He tapped his radio. "We found him. Repeat, we found the boy." The woods erupted with distant cheers as the other teams converged. Ethan crouched beside Cale, who was now licking the boy's face gently, whining with relief. "You did it. Ethan said softly, his hands finding Cale's neck. You found him. But their triumph was short-lived. A rumbling sound echoed from the direction of the quarry, deep, ominous. The recent rain had loosened the ground, and part of the slope above them began to give way. Move! Daniel shouted, grabbing Ethan and Noah by the arms. Cale barked frantically as chunks of earth and stone tumbled down. The flashlight fell, beams spinning wildly across the chaos. In confusion, Ethan slipped, his cane clattering out of reach. Cale, he cried. The dog lunged forward, grabbing the boy's jacket sleeve in his teeth, dragging him backward just as the edge of the cliff collapsed. Dirt and rocks crashed into the ravine below with a deafening roar. Daniels threw himself forward, grabbing Ethan's arm with one hand and Noah with the other. For a heartbeat, it seemed the entire hillside would crumble beneath them. But Cale dug in, muscles straining, holding firm until the ground settled. When the dust cleared, Daniels exhaled shakily. Everyone okay? Ethan coughed, nodding weakly. Cale saved me, he whispered. The dog stood beside him, chest heaving, muzzle streaked with dirt. Daniels crouched, pressing his forehead briefly against Cale's. Good boy, he murmured. You're a damn hero. By the time they reached the main road, the paramedics were waiting. Noah was wrapped in a blanket and placed in the ambulance, clutching Cale's fur with a trembling hand. The reporters who had gathered by the barricades erupted into questions. But Ethan didn't hear them. He was sitting quietly beside Cale, one arm draped around the dog's neck, the two of them breathing in sync beneath the flashing lights. Later that night, after the chaos subsided, Daniels found Ethan sitting alone outside the precinct, Cale's head resting in his lap. You scared the hell out of me, Daniels said with a half-smile. Ethan chuckled softly. We were okay. Cale knew where to go. Daniels sat beside him. You know, the chief wants to make Cale an honorary rescue dog after tonight. Says he's earned his badge. Ethan's face lit up. Really? Really? Daniel confirmed. And he says something else, too. Cale's got a permanent handler now. The boy frowned slightly. Who? Daniel smiled. You, kid, if your mom agrees. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he buried his face in Cale's fur, whispering through tears and laughter. Hear that, boy? You're my partner now. Cale barked softly in reply, tail thumping against the pavement. Daniels looked up at the night sky, stars faint but flickering through the city haze. You know, he said quietly, when people say miracles don't happen anymore, I'll tell them about a blind kid and a broken dog who found each other and a lost child in the dark. That night, the precinct didn't just gain a hero. It rediscovered what it meant to believe. Not in orders or rules, but in trust that defied every boundary of reason. Months passed, but the story of Ethan and Cale never faded. Newspapers ran headlines like Blind Boy and K-9 Hero Save Missing Child, and the whisper that changed everything. The story spread far beyond their small town, across states, across oceans. Schools used it as a lesson in compassion. Police departments cited it in conferences about emotional intelligence in K-9 training. But for Ethan and Cale, the fame meant nothing. Their world remained simple, one of quiet walks, shared laughter, and unspoken understanding. After the rescue, the department held an official ceremony. The mayor stood on the steps of City Hall, the evening sunlight glinting off polished badges and medals. Today, he declared, we honor bravery, not just a kind measure by strength, but by heart. He turned to Ethan, who stood with his mother, one hand resting gently on Cale's back. The crowd applauded, cameras flashing like fireworks, though Ethan could only sense their warmth through the vibrations of the air and the thundering rhythm of clapping hands. When the mayor placed a small silver medallion around Cale's neck, the dog didn't flinch or bark. He simply looked up at Ethan, tail swaying gently, as if to ask, did I do good? Ethan grinned. You did perfect, partner. Daniel stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes misty. He'd trained dozens of dogs, led countless operations, but nothing in his career had moved him like this. When the applause died down, he crouched beside the boy. You know, kid, he said softly, you've taught this old dog trainer more than all my years in the field. Ethan tilted his head. Like what? That maybe training isn't about control. Daniel said, it's about connection. You didn't make Cale obey. You reminded him he wasn't alone. Ethan smiled faintly. That's what he did for me, too. After that day, Ethan was allowed to visit the precinct whenever he wanted. Cale was officially retired from active service, reclassified as a therapy and companion dog. But his duties didn't end there. Together, he and Ethan began visiting hospitals and schools, offering comfort to those who felt broken or lost. It was uncanny how Cale seemed to sense pain, not just physical, but emotional. In hospital corridors, he would sit quietly beside patients before Ethan even reached them. In classrooms, he would rest his head on the lap of a nervous child until their shaking stopped. During one visit, a girl named Lila, who had lost her voice after a car accident, sat motionless as Cale approached. She didn't speak, didn't move. Ethan, sensing the silence, knelt beside her. You don't have to talk, he whispered. He listens without words. The girl's hand trembled, then found Cale's fur. Moments later, for the first time in months, she whispered, Hi! Her mother wept silently from across the room. Word of these moments reached far and wide. Experts came with notebooks, microphones, and theories. Some said it was Cale's scent recognition of stress hormones. Others said it was Ethan's tone and rhythmic empathy. But those who witnessed the pair knew the truth couldn't be measured in data. It was something pure, a bridge between two beings who saw through blindness, one literal, the other emotional. Claire often watched them from the kitchen window as they sat together under the old maple tree in their backyard, Ethan humming softly, Cale lying at his feet. Sometimes the boy would whisper to him, low and tender, You know, I still don't remember where I heard your name that day. Cale would lift his head, eyes gleaming, as if to answer, It doesn't matter. You remembered me when I forgot myself. Years later, when Ethan was older and taller, the story of that day at the quarry was still told in police academies. Recruits would listen as Daniels, now retired, recounted the legend of the K-9 once deemed uncontrollable. You can't command trust, he'd tell them. You earn it, and sometimes you earn it from those who can't even see your face. Ethan and Cale grew inseparable. They trained together, lived together, and when Ethan began volunteering at the precinct as a young teenager, Cale went with him, wearing his polished badge like a soldier still on duty. They were more than a handler and a dog. They were a living reminder that broken things can be mended, not through fear or power, but through understanding. But time, as it always does, kept moving. Cale grew older. His fur turned gray around the muzzle, his steps slower, his breaths heavier. Ethan noticed, of course he did. One night, sitting on the porch, he rested his head against Cale's side. You're tired, huh? He murmured. The dog let out a long sigh, eyes closing as if to say, just a little. Ethan smiled through tears. It's okay. You can rest. You've done enough for 100 lifetimes. When Cale passed peacefully in his sleep a few months later, the entire town mourned. Flags at the precinct flew at half-mast. The officers who had once feared him carried his collar in a small velvet box, and Daniels, now gray-haired, spoke softly at the memorial. He was supposed to be put down, he said. Instead, he lifted us all up. Ethan stood silently throughout the service, one hand on Cale's collar, the other clutching the silver medallion that had once hung around his friend's neck. As the crowd dispersed, he knelt by the small marker beneath the tree they'd often sat under. The stone read simply, Cale, the dog who listened. Ethan smiled through his tears and whispered the word that had started it all. Cale. For a moment, he could almost hear it, that familiar huff of breath, that soft thump of a wagging tail. The wind rustled the leaves above, gentle as a sigh. Years later, when Ethan became an animal therapist himself, people often asked how he'd learned to understand animals so deeply. He would smile and say, Someone once taught me that you don't have to see to understand. You just have to listen. And every time he said it, he would reach into his pocket, feeling the small, warm medallion, the one that still bore Cale's name. Because somewhere beyond sight, beyond words, beyond even the limits of life, that first whisper, the one that healed a broken soul, still echoed softly through time, a whisper heard forever.